One of the most amazing experiences that a human can have, in my opinion, is to sit in front of a fire. Especially when you're at least a little bit uncomfortably cold. There's this beautiful combined sensation of cold, but then the heat's coming in. And it's sort of this constant thing. You're not just hot, you're not just cold. It's a combination. There's something almost eternal about the fire. You could watch it for even hours on end, enjoying the peace, and it just doesn't get boring. At least for me. So recently I was at a friend's house who has a backyard that is conducive to a nice outdoor fire. And we just sat in front of it and enjoyed a nice chat. That's another thing about a fire. It just seems to bring out more serious conversations. And so that evening we were talking about different things, but we got to the subject of modesty. And we ended up asking the question at some point, who who should be the one to determine whether an article of clothing is modest? We do have rules, general guidelines that we can follow, that we should follow as Catholics, as Christians. But perhaps when there's almost a borderline case, who's best equipped to judge, to determine whether this is modest? So that's kind of what we were talking about. I'm sure, in fact, yeah, I'm positive that we're not the first ones to answer that question, I think, pretty accurately. Um, but in any case, it was a nice thought experiment, and so I just wanted to share it with you. So we can probably start first by simply asking, what is modesty? And modesty, it's actually kind of a more general term than I think we usually use it. But for the purposes of this discussion, it is just going to be focused on modesty of dress. So, what is modesty of dress? We could probably define it simply as the clothing worn that would correspond to observing the sixth and ninth commandments. And so we can ask ourselves, kind of, first of all, well, why is there clothing to begin with? Well, as you may know, there was a fall, there was an original sin, and as a result of that original sin, our will was weakened, our passions were weakened, our intellect was weakened, and so as a result, we didn't have as much control over our passions as we used to. And so clothing is, at least the major purpose of clothing, is to ensure, as much as we can, that in our social interactions with each other, we will be able to observe those six and ninth commandments. That we will be able to have passions under control, and we'll be able to act in a rational and reasonable manner. So, taking it a step further, what is the purpose of modesty? We kind of answered it already, but maybe we could be more particular and precise. I think we can say that the purpose of modesty, in fact, there's at least a couple, and what I'm focusing on right now is one aspect of it. It's to help. It's to prevent, as much as we're able individually. It's to help prevent, as much as possible, any sins committed by others towards us or about us regarding the sixth and ninth commandments. So it's to do our part as much as possible to help others, primarily of the opposite sex, from committing any sins against those commandments. It's to help them to practice virtue. So what who, who does that refer to? So if someone wants to be dressing modestly and understands that she or he has to, who are those people that they're trying to avoid committing sin? Well, for an unmarried person, that's everyone essentially, and for the married person, that's everyone minus one person. So it's pretty universal at the end of the day. So that we can say is the sort of negative purpose of modesty. When I say negative, I mean it's to prevent this thing from happening. Okay, it's to prevent sin, it's to prevent evil, and that's what I'm primarily going to focus on here. But I don't want to just leave it completely at that. I do want to address also the more positive side of it. So the negative is to prevent sin. What is the positive side of modesty in dress? And I'm going to pivot here a little bit. Modesty in dress has to do with both men and women, but for this conversation, I'd like to focus primarily on feminine modesty. For one, because it does have a greater effect on the overall morality of a society, but also because it's gonna be pretty important for this next part. So even though this does apply to both sides, I do want to focus on feminine modesty here. So on the positive side, what is the purpose of modesty? And I would say it's really, if the negative side is to prevent sin, the positive side is to lead those same men, it's to lead them to higher things, to bring them above just the lower things, above just the passions. It's really a beautiful thing. When God created, he's always putting something of himself in creation. He's always leaving a little reflection or a big reflection of his nature, of who he is. When he made man and woman, in a sense, he took himself, his nature, his attributes, his characteristics, if we can even say that, and in a sense, he divided it in two. So for men, he took the side of authority, of strength, logic, and so on. In the woman, he wanted to express in his creation, he wanted to express his beauty, his gentleness, his affection, his love. And so if we take that perspective, we see it that way. What's the positive side of modesty? It's really to help everyone, but obviously in particular men, to see this woman, and instead of just being dragged to the ground in passion, it's to lift him up, to see a reflection of God, ultimately. And so a woman that dresses truly modestly, and who conducts herself in a dignified Christian manner, that woman is going to lead a large number of men to consider higher things. And when they look upon her, it's going to be similar to when men looked upon Our Lady. Men were just not able to ever have an impure desire towards Our Lady. So for a woman who emulates Our Lady in that way as much as possible, it's going to be pretty similar. Men who look at her are simply not going to be able, in a way, to ever have a sinful desire about her or towards her. And they're going to be led to higher things through her, yes, her beauty, but her beauty in an ordered fashion. It's really a beautiful thing. So that's the positive side of modesty. Here, the main focus, though, is on the negative side. So if we now go to that main question of who's best equipped to judge whether this woman is dressed, acting in a modest fashion, or this article of clothing is modest, who's best equipped, and in this case again we're talking about particularly feminine modesty, who's best equipped to decide whether this woman is modestly dressed or not? And I think the answer just is pretty simple. We just go back to the principle. Why modesty? To prevent members of the opposite sex from having any, as much as we're able to prevent it, to prevent them from having impure desires towards you. And who are those people with regard to a woman? It's going to be men. And so the answer, I think, is pretty simple. It's going to be the best judge on that regard is going to be a man who is serious about being virtuous, who wants to be chaste, who is, and someone who is normal and balanced, who can make a good judgment. That's going to be the best person, I think, to be able to tell a woman that you're dressed in a modest fashion, or you're not dressed in a modest fashion, or that you are pretty modestly dressed, but not perfectly. There's a little bit of room to improve. You know, a woman, even a very good woman, can give very good advice on that, for sure. There's no doubt. And yet, because that woman is not a man, she can never know what it's like to be tempted as a man, and vice versa. A man will never know what it's like to feel a temptation like a woman. And so she may say something or do something, and this goes beyond modesty, but she may feel something deep down that a man will never know how it feels. And so there has to be an understanding and compassion for that, as there has to be for the woman towards a man, especially in the regard of chastity. So a woman will never know how it really feels to be tempted. And it goes beyond just an exact rule in chastity, in modesty. So a woman might say, I can't understand. She may be trying to dress modestly, and she may dress quite modestly. And yet a man might say, there's a little bit of improvement you can make. She might say, I just cannot understand. I cannot understand how this is in any sense provocative or immodest at all. And the truth is, she's right. She cannot understand. Why? Because she's not a man. So that's why at the end of the day, I believe that women can be very good judges of modesty. But at the end of the day, when it comes to this feminine modesty, I think that the most effective judge, the most real, honest, I suppose, judge in that is going to be a good man. And so if a good man who wants to be chaste, who wants to be holy, who is normal and balanced and can give a good judgment, if such a man were to come to you and say, there's some kind of room for improvement in your modesty, in my opinion, I think that's a comment to be considered and to be taken seriously.